This is how the US Navy would respond to a Venezuelan sub and why it matters more than you think. Let me take you back to March 14, 2024, a date that, if you asked most Americans, would probably draw a blank. No major headlines, no breaking news alerts. But on that day, the U.S. Southern Command quietly issued a statement that should have set off alarm bells in Washington, Miami, and Caracas. Buried in a routine operational update was a single line that caught my eye: the U.S. Navy has conducted enhanced maritime domain awareness operations in the Caribbean Sea, including tracking of underwater contacts of interest. Now, to the average reader, that sounds like bureaucratic jargon. But to those of us who've spent decades studying naval warfare and Latin American geopolitics, that phrase, underwater contacts of interest, is code for one submarines. And not just any submarines. We're talking about the kind of subs that could, in theory, slip past U.S. surveillance, deliver a payload, or even, if we're being brutally honest, threaten the AMA Canal. I've been tracking this story for years, long before it became a blip on the radar of mainstream media. And what I'm about to tell you isn't just about a single Venezuelan submarine. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, the quiet but relentless push by Russia and China to erode U.S. dominance, and the dangerous miscalculations that could turn the Caribbean into the next flashpoint of great power competition. Most importantly, it's about what happens when a superpower, stretched thin by 2 decades of endless war, suddenly realizes it's no longer the only player in its own backyard. But before we get into the real story, let's start with what you've probably heard, or rather, what you haven't heard. The official what they want you to believe. If you've followed U.S. media coverage of Venezuela in the last few years, you've seen a familiar Nicolas Maduro as a dictator, his regime as a narco-state, and the U.S. is leading a noble effort to restore democracy. When it comes to Venezuela's military, the story is even a corrupt, poorly equipped force that poses no real threat to American interests. Sure, there's the occasional flare-up, sanctions, oil embargoes, even a failed coup attempt in 2019, but by and large, Venezuela is treated as a regional nuisance, not a strategic adversary. Now, let's talk about submarines. In 2021, the U.S. Navy released a report titled Undersea Warfare in the 21st Century, which, among other things, assessed the submarine capabilities of potential adversaries. Venezuela didn't even make the list. The official line from the Pentagon is that while Venezuela has a few aging diesel-electric subs, hand-me-downs from Russia in the early 2000s, they're outdated, poorly maintained, and no match for U.S. anti-submarine warfare capabilities. When pressed, defense officials will tell you that the real concern isn't Caracas, it's Moscow and Beijing using Venezuela as a proxy to project power into the Caribbean. And to some extent, they're not wrong. Russia has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela for years, supplying arms, conducting joint exercises, and even stationing nuclear-capable bombers in the country. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a key node in its Belt and Road Initiative, investing billions in infrastructure and energy projects. So when the U.S. talks about underwater contacts of interest, the subtext is this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about Russia and China. The media has largely echoed this framing. In 2023, the Wall Street Journal ran a piece titled Russia's Shadow Fleet in the Caribbean Raises U.S. Concerns, detailing how Moscow was using commercial vessels to smuggle oil and potentially military equipment into Venezuela. The New York Times followed up with an investigation into Chinese dual-use ports in the region, hinting at their potential military applications. And in March of this year, Reuters reported that the U.S. had increased its P-8 Poseidon surveillance flights over the Caribbean, specifically to monitor unusual maritime activity. All of this paints a picture of a U.S. Navy on high alert, but in a defensive posture, reacting to external threats rather than initiating action. The message is we've got this under control. Venezuela is a paper tiger. Russia and China are testing us, but they're not foolish enough to push too far. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, what you don't know can kill you. Deconstructing the what's really happening in the Caribbean. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1, Venezuela's submarine fleet isn't as useless as you've been told. The U.S. likes to dismiss Venezuela's submarines as relics. And on paper, they're not wrong. Venezuela's fleet consists of 2 Sapphire-class diesel-electric subs, purchased from Russia in the early 2000s. These are the same class of subs that Russia has used to devastating effect in the Black Sea against Ukraine, capable of launching caliber cruise missiles, laying mines, and conducting covert surveillance. Now, the US will tell you that these subs are old, that Venezuela lacks the maintenance infrastructure to keep them operational, and that their crews are poorly trained. And to some extent, that's true. But here's what they're not telling. In 2022, satellite imagery confirmed that one of Venezuela's subs, the Sabalo, was undergoing a major refit at a dockyard in Puerto Cabello. The upgrades? Likely the installation of new sonar systems and possibly even the integration of Russian-made Club-S cruise missiles capable of hitting targets up to 300 kilometers away. In 2023, a declassified U.S. intelligence report noted that Venezuela had been sending submariners to train in Russia and Iran, two countries with extensive experience in asymmetric naval warfare. The report concluded that while Venezuela's subs were still no match for the U.S. Navy in a direct confrontation, they were becoming increasingly capable of denial operations, that is, making it too risky for U.S. ships to operate freely in the Caribbean. Most alarmingly, in early 2024, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon detected a Venezuelan sub operating in international waters near the Dutch island of Aruba. The sub was submerged for over 72 hours, a feat that requires advanced battery technology and skilled crew coordination. This wasn't a training exercise. This was a demonstration of capability. Fact number 2, Russia and China aren't just testing the US, they're building a foothold. The US frames Russian and Chinese activity in Venezuela as opportunistic, exploiting a weak regime to gain leverage. But the reality is far more strategic. Since 2019, Russia has been quietly exiting its military presence in Venezuela. In 2020, it deployed two Tu-160 Blackjack strategic bombers to the country, a move that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. More recently, in 2023, Russia began construction on a new signals intelligence facility in Venezuela, capable of monitoring U.S. naval and air traffic in the Caribbean. And in early 2024, U.S. intelligence detected a Russian Kilo-class submarine, one of the quietest diesel-electric subs in the world, operating in Venezuelan waters. This wasn't a port call. This was a deployment. China's law, and while Russia makes the headlines, China is playing a quieter but even more dangerous game. In 2022, China completed construction on a deep-water port in Venezuela's Paraguana Peninsula, just 150 miles from the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Officially, it's a commercial facility. But satellite imagery shows hardened bunkers, reinforced piers, and what appears to be a submarine maintenance bay. In 2023, China also began supplying Venezuela with HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, a system that, if deployed near the coast, could threaten U.S. aircraft operating in the region. The key here isn't that Venezuela is suddenly a naval powerhouse. It's that Russia and China are using Venezuela as a forward operating base, a place to project power, gather intelligence, and, if necessary, challenge U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Fact number 3, the U.S. Navy is already preparing for a submarine threat, but it's not admitting it. If you listen to the Pentagon, the U.S. Navy's posture in the Caribbean is purely defensive. But the actions tell a different story. In 2023, the U.S. Navy reactivated its Fourth Fleet, a command that had been dormant since 1950, to oversee operations in the Caribbean and South America. Officially, this was about counter-narcotics and humanitarian missions. But the Fourth Fleet's new commander, Rear Admiral Doug Perry, has a background in anti-submarine warfare. In early 2024, the U.S. deployed a Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine to the Caribbean for the first time in over a decade. These subs are designed for hunting other submarines. Most tellingly, in March 2024, the U.S. Navy conducted a series of unannounced ASW exercises in the Caribbean, simulating the detection and tracking of a diesel-electric submarine. The scenario? A hostile sub attempting to lay mines near the AMA Canal. Now, the US will tell you these are routine exercises. But here's the thing about routine: they don't happen in secret. And they don't involve Virginia-class subs unless you're preparing for something specific. Fact number 4, there's a hidden economic motive behind all of this. Let's talk about oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For decades, the U.S. has treated Venezuela as a reliable supplier, even under Chavez and Maduro. But in 2019, the Trump administration imposed a full embargo on Venezuelan oil, cutting off the regime's primary source of revenue. The stated goal? To force Maduro out of power. But here's the it didn't work. Instead of collapsing, Venezuela turned to Russia and China. Russia's state-owned oil company, Rosneft, stepped in to buy Venezuelan crude, while China's CNPC began investing in Venezuela's oil infrastructure. By 2023, Venezuela was exporting more oil than it had in years, just not to the US. And that's where the submarines come in. If the US ever decided to enforce a naval blockade of Venezuela, something that's been discussed in hawkish circles for years, those subs become a major problem. They can't stop a US carrier strike group, but they can make it costly. A single Kilo-class sub, armed with mines or cruise missiles, could force the US Navy to divert significant resources to protect shipping lanes. And in a crisis, that could be the difference between a quick, decisive operation and a prolonged, messy conflict. So what's really happening here? The US isn't just worried about Venezuela's submarines. It's worried about a future where Russia and China can use Venezuela as a base to challenge US control over the Caribbean and, by extension, the global oil market. The broader geopolitical why the Caribbean is the next great power battleground. To understand why a single Venezuelan submarine matters, you have to out. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American unipolarity and the return of great power competition to the Western Hemisphere, a region the US has treated as its exclusive sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine. The realist spheres of influence and the return of great power politics. For decades, the US operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image. After the Cold War, Washington pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, spreading democracy, free markets, and American military power to every corner of the globe. The idea was if the US could integrate countries into a US-led order, they'd never challenge American dominance. But that strategy has failed. Spectacularly. In the Middle East, 2 decades of war have left the US bogged down in unwinnable conflicts, while Russia and China have extended their influence in Iran, Syria, and beyond. In Europe, NATO action, once seen as a way to lock in US dominance, has instead provoked a Russian backlash, culminating in the invasion of Ukraine. And in Latin America, the US has spent years lecturing countries about democracy and human rights, only to watch as they turn to China for investment and Russia for arms. The result? A world that no longer accepts US primacy. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Caribbean. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and no one told Washington. For 200 years, the Monroe Doctrine was the cornerstone of US policy in the Western no foreign powers allowed. But today, Russia and China are openly flouting that principle. Russia has military bases in Nicaragua and Venezuela, conducts joint exercises with Cuba, and has even floated the idea of a permanent naval presence in the Caribbean. China has invested over $150 billion in Latin America since 2005, becoming the region's second-largest trading partner. It's building ports in AMA, El Salvador, and Jamaica, all within striking distance of U.S. naval bases. And both countries are using Venezuela as a test. Can we challenge U.S. dominance in its own backyard without provoking a major response? The answer, so far, is yes. And that's the real danger. Historical: the Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? If this sounds familiar, it should. In 1962, the US and Soviet Union nearly went to war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. The crisis was resolved when the Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of US missiles from Turkey. But today, the dynamics are different. This isn't a binary Cold War standoff. It's a three-way competition, with China playing an increasingly assertive role. And unlike in 1962, the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon in the region. In the 1960s, the US had overwhelming naval superiority in the Caribbean. Today, the US Navy is stretched thin, with only 68 submarines in its fleet, down from over 100 during the Cold War. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union was a distant second to the US in global power. Today, China is a near-peer competitor, and Russia, while weakened, still has the ability to project power into the Western Hemisphere. Most importantly, in the 1960s, the US could afford to take risks. Today, with wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and rising tensions with China over Taiwan, the US is already overstretched. This is the nightmare scenario for US. A crisis in the Caribbean at the same time as a conflict in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Military and strategic how the US Navy would actually respond. So let's say it happens. A Venezuelan submarine, possibly with Russian or Chinese advisors on board, is detected operating in the Caribbean. Maybe it's laying mines near the AMA Canal. Maybe it's shadowing a US carrier strike group. Maybe it's just there, a silent reminder that the US no longer has free rein in its own backyard. How would the US Navy respond? Phase 1, Detection and Tracking. The first step would be confirming the sub's presence. The US has a network of underwater sensors, known as the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, that can detect submarines at long range. But diesel-electric subs like Venezuela's are quiet, especially when running on batteries. If the sub is operating in shallow waters near the coast, it could be nearly impossible to detect. Assuming the US does pick up the sub, the next step would be tracking it. This is where the P-8 Poseidon comes in. These aircraft are equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors and sonobuoys, devices that can detect the faint magnetic signature of a submarine or listen for its acoustic profile. But again, if the sub is running silently, it could slip away. Phase 2, Escalation and Deterrence. If the US confirms that a Venezuelan sub is operating in a way that threatens US interests, say, near the AMA Canal or a major shipping lane, the next step would be deterrence. This could take several. The US could issue a statement, as it did in 2023 when it detected a Russian sub near Cuba, warning that any hostile action would be met with a proportional response. The US could deploy additional assets to the region, a carrier strike group, a Virginia-class sub, or even a Seawolf-class attack sub. Cyber and electronic. The US could attempt to disrupt the sub's communications or navigation systems, forcing it to surface. But here's the deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And right now, Venezuela and its backers in Moscow and Beijing have reason to doubt that. Phase 3, the decision to engage. If deterrence fails, the US would have to decide whether to engage the sub. And this is where things get messy. Option 1, Forced Surfacing. The US could use acoustic harassment devices, essentially underwater speakers that emit loud, disorienting noises, to force the sub to surface. This is what the US did in 2009 when it forced a Chinese sub to surface near a US carrier strike. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Option 1, Forced Surfacing. It sounds clean, almost surgical, like something out of a Tom Clancy novel. But in reality, it's a high-stakes gamble with no guarantee of success and every chance of escalation. The 2009 incident with the Chinese sub near the USS John C. Stennis is often cited as a textbook example, but what most people don't realize is how close that situation came to spiraling out of control. The Chinese sub didn't surface because it was outmaneuvered, it surfaced because Beijing calculated that the political cost of not doing so would be worse than the humiliation. That's not a military victory. That's a diplomatic off-ramp, and Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, might not take the same exit. Now, let's talk about Option 2, Kinetic Action. If the US decides the sub is an imminent threat, say, it's shadowing a carrier strike group or positioning itself near the AMA Canal, then the rules of engagement change. The Navy's playbook here is locate, track, and if necessary, disable or destroy. The tools for this are formidable. The P-8 Poseidon can drop Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes, which are designed to hunt quiet diesel-electric subs in shallow waters. The Virginia-class attack subs, like the USS Texas or North Dakota, carry heavier Mk-48 torpedoes, which can turn a submarine into a metal coffin in seconds. And then there are the unmanned systems, like the Orca extra-large unmanned undersea vehicle, that could be deployed to shadow or even ram a hostile sub. But here's the none of this happens in a vacuum. Every torpedo fired, every sub disabled, is a geopolitical earthquake. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't acting alone. Since 2019, Russia has been deepening its military ties with Caracas, selling them Su-30 fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and yes, even offering to base nuclear-capable bombers in the country. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, with Beijing now controlling vast swaths of Venezuela's oil infrastructure. If the US sinks a Venezuelan sub, it's not just sinking a boat, it's sinking a proxy of two great powers. And that's where the establishment narrative starts to unravel. The Pentagon likes to talk about great power competition as if it's a chess match, where moves are calculated and escalation is controlled. But in reality, the rules of this game are being rewritten in real time. Russia and China have spent the last decade studying how the US fights, and they've designed their strategies to exploit its weaknesses. One of those weaknesses? The American public's tolerance for casualties. Another? The legal and political constraints of fighting a war without a formal declaration. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The US Navy hasn't engaged in a full-scale submarine hunt since the Cold War, and even then, the stakes were different. Back in the 1980s, the Soviet Navy was a known quantity, its subs had predictable acoustic signatures, its crews followed rigid protocols, and its leadership understood the risks of direct confrontation. Today's adversaries are playing a different game. Russia's Kilo-class subs, which Venezuela operates, are designed to be stealthy, cheap, and expendable. China's Type 039A subs are even quieter, with air-independent propulsion that lets them stay submerged for weeks. And both countries have invested heavily in swarming tactics, using multiple subs to overwhelm US tracking capabilities. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US Navy is already stretched thin. The Pacific Fleet is focused on China, the Sixth Fleet in Europe is dealing with Russia, and the Fourth Fleet, responsible for the Caribbean and South America, is a skeleton crew by comparison. If a Venezuelan sub starts harassing US shipping, the Navy would have to pull assets from other theaters, creating openings for Beijing or Moscow to exploit elsewhere. That's not a hypothetical. In 2022, when the US was distracted by Ukraine, China conducted large-scale military exercises around Taiwan, testing how far it could push before the US could respond. A Venezuelan sub-crisis could be the next distraction. Here's another uncomfortable: the US doesn't have a good answer for what comes after the sub is sunk. If the sub is destroyed, Venezuela will cry foul, Russia will demand an investigation, and China will use it as proof of American hegemony. The US could try to frame it as self-defense, but international law is murky when it comes to subs. Unlike surface ships, submarines don't have to surface and identify themselves before attacking. That's why the US has historically been reluctant to engage them, because once the shooting starts, there's no going back. And that brings me to the aftermath. If the US sinks a Venezuelan sub, the Maduro regime will use it as a rallying cry, portraying itself as the victim of American aggression. Russia and China will amplify that narrative, using it to justify further military support for Caracas. The US, meanwhile, will be left with a double down and risk a wider conflict, or back off and look weak. Neither option is appealing. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome isn't a dramatic naval battle, it's a slow-burn crisis, where the US and Venezuela engage in a shadow war of probes and counter-probes, each side testing the other's resolve. The Navy will deploy more P-8s, more sonobuoys, more unmanned systems. Venezuela will push the limits, seeing how close it can get to US assets without triggering a response. And in the background, Russia and China will be watching, learning, and adjusting their strategies accordingly. The real danger isn't that Venezuela will sink a US ship, it's that this becomes the new normal. A world where small, rogue states can punch above their weight by leveraging great power backing. A world where the US is constantly on the defensive, reacting to crises rather than shaping the environment. And a world where the rules of engagement are so ambiguous that even a single miscalculation could spiral into something much worse. That's the reality of modern naval warfare. It's not about sinking ships, it's about managing escalation, controlling narratives, and outmaneuvering adversaries who don't play by the old rules. And right now, the US is still trying to figure out how to win that game. Now, what most people don't realize is that this kind of shadow war isn't just a military problem, it's a domestic political tinderbox waiting to ignite. The US Navy can track Venezuelan subs all it wants, but the moment an American warship fires a torpedo or a Venezuelan diesel-electric surfaces within sight of a carrier strike group, the decision-making shifts from the Pentagon to the White House. And that's where things get messy. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. political establishment has spent the last 2 decades oscillating between two equally dangerous overreaction and paralysis. On one side, you have the hawks, think Lindsey Graham or the more bellicose corners of the Heritage Foundation, who would see a Venezuelan sub as a casus belli, a chance to finally solve the Maduro problem with a single decisive strike. They'll point to the 2003 Iraq War as a cautionary tale of inaction, ignoring the fact that the U.S. has spent the last 20 years trying to extricate itself from the consequences of exactly that kind of thinking. On the other side, you have the doves, the realists, the ones who remember the Bay of Pigs and the Iran-Contra fiasco, who will argue that any kinetic response plays right into Maduro's hands, turning him into a martyr for the anti-imperialist cause. Here's the uncomfortable: neither side has a coherent strategy for this kind of gray zone conflict. The hawks want to treat Venezuela like a rogue state that can be deterred with overwhelming force, but they underestimate how much the rules have changed. Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein, he's not operating in a vacuum. He's got Russian intelligence officers embedded in his military, Chinese surveillance drones patrolling his coasts, and Iranian advisors helping him evade sanctions. A direct strike on a Venezuelan sub wouldn't just be an attack on Caracas, it would be a provocation to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. And unlike in the Cold War, when the US and USSR had back channels to manage escalation, today's great power competition is defined by deniability and ambiguity. Russia won't admit its subs are in Venezuelan waters, China won't confirm its satellite data, and Iran will just smile and say it's all a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the doves' approach, diplomacy, sanctions, and patience has its own flaws. Sanctions haven't toppled Maduro in 6 years, and the longer the US waits, the more entrenched his regime becomes. The Biden administration's recent overtures to Caracas, including the 2023 prisoner swap and the temporary easing of oil sanctions, were an attempt to break the stalemate. But those moves were met with howls of protest from both sides of the aisle. Republicans accused Biden of rewarding a dictator, while progressives argued that any engagement with Maduro was a betrayal of Venezuela's democratic opposition. The result? A policy that's too soft for the hawks and too hard for the doves, leaving the U.S. with no good options. So where does that leave us in a scenario where a Venezuelan sub actually does something provocative, say, locking onto a U.S. destroyer with its fire control radar, or worse, firing a torpedo that misses? The answer depends on who's in the Oval Office. If it's a president like Trump, who has a history of impulsive decision-making, the response could be swift and disproportionate. Trump's national security team in 2020 was stacked with regime change advocates like John Bolton, who famously said that the troika of tyranny was the greatest threat to U.S. security in the hemisphere. A second Trump term would likely mean a return to maximum pressure, with the Navy given a freer hand to interdict Venezuelan assets. If it's Biden, or a Democratic successor, the response would probably be more measured, but no less risky. Biden's team has spent the last 3 years trying to avoid direct military confrontation with Russia and China, even as they've ramped up support for Ukraine and Taiwan. The lesson they've taken from those conflicts is that the U.S. can't afford another forever war, but also that weakness invites aggression. In a Venezuelan sub-crisis, they'd likely default to a mix of diplomatic pressure and covert action. We'd see more sanctions, more cyber operations, maybe even a quiet sabotage campaign against Venezuelan ports. But they'd stop short of a kinetic strike, because the political costs would be too high. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has been increasingly vocal about ending endless wars, would revolt. The media would frame it as another Iraq-style blunder. And Maduro, ever the opportunist, would use it to rally his base. Here's the neither approach actually solves the problem. The hawk strategy of escalation risks turning Venezuela into a proxy war with Russia, while the dove strategy of containment allows Maduro to consolidate power. The real solution, if there is one, lies somewhere in between. The U.S. needs to recognize that Venezuela isn't just a rogue state, it's a node in a larger network of revisionist powers that are testing the limits of American influence. That means treating the sub-threat not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader challenge to U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Let me give you an example of what that might look like. In 2020, the U.S. Southern Command quietly began deploying more P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft to bases in Florida and the Caribbean. Those flights weren't just about tracking Venezuelan subs, they were about sending a message to Russia and China. The US knows that Moscow and Beijing are using Venezuela as a testing ground for their own anti-access/area denial strategies, the same ones they've deployed in the South China Sea and the Baltic. By increasing its surveillance presence, the US is essentially, we see what you're doing, and we're not going to let you turn the Caribbean into another contested zone. But surveillance alone isn't enough. The US also needs to think about how to degrade Venezuela's capabilities without triggering a wider conflict. That could mean working with regional partners, Colombia, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, to interdict Venezuelan arms shipments. It could mean using cyber tools to disrupt Venezuela's command and control systems, as the US did with Iran's nuclear program in the 2010s. Or it could mean reviving the kind of covert action that the CIA used to undermine leftist governments in the 1980s, but with a modern twist. Think drone strikes on drug cartel leaders who double as Maduro's enforcers, or economic sabotage to starve the regime of hard currency. The problem is that all of these options come with risks. Covert action can backfire spectacularly, as it did in the Bay of Pigs. Cyber operations can escalate into full-blown cyber warfare, as we saw with Russia's attacks on Ukraine. And working with regional partners can create blowback if those partners are seen as US puppets. The US has spent decades trying to convince Latin America that it's not the imperialist hegemon of the Monroe Doctrine, but every time it intervenes in the region, it reinforces that narrative. So what's the endgame here? The most likely scenario is that the US and Venezuela continue their slow-motion standoff, with neither side willing to make the first move. The Navy will keep tracking Venezuelan subs, Maduro will keep playing the victim, and Russia and China will keep exploiting the chaos. But that doesn't mean the status quo is stable. In fact, it's the opposite. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that a miscalculation, a Venezuelan captain who ICS, a US admiral who overreacts, a Russian advisor who pushes too hard, will turn a cold conflict into a hot one. And that's the real danger of this moment. The US is still operating under the assumption that it can control the escalation ladder, that it can ratchet up pressure on Venezuela without provoking a response from Moscow or Beijing. But that's a Cold War mindset in a post-Cold War world. Today's adversaries don't play by the same rules. They don't have red lines, they have gray zones. They don't seek victory, they seek to exhaust their opponents. And they're betting that the US, with its polarized politics and short attention will blink first. The question, will they be right? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of US power projection in an era where the old rules no longer apply. The Navy's response to a Venezuelan submarine isn't just a tactical problem, it's a test case for how Washington will handle the next generation of asymmetric threats. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 3 decades perfecting a style of warfare built on overwhelming technological superiority, stealth fighters, carrier strike groups, precision-guided munitions. But what happens when your adversary doesn't fight on your terms? What happens when they don't even try to match your fleet, but instead deploy a handful of diesel-electric subs, a few hundred mercenaries, and a web of cyber proxies? That's the question Venezuela, and by extension, Russia and China, are forcing the US to answer. Here's the uncomfortable: the Pentagon's playbook for dealing with rogue states is outdated. It was written in the 1990s, when the US was the sole superpower and the biggest threat to American dominance was a failed state with a few Scud missiles. Today, the threats are more diffuse, more deniable, and far more interconnected. A Venezuelan sub isn't just a Venezuelan sub, it's a Russian training exercise, a Chinese intelligence gathering platform, and a test of US resolve all rolled into one. And the Navy's response will set the tone for how Washington deals with similar challenges in the years to come, from Iranian fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz to Chinese maritime militia vessels in the South China Sea. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is to double down on the current: more sanctions, more surveillance, more deterrence by presence. But as we've seen in places like Syria and Ukraine, this kind of incremental pressure often leads to incremental escalation. The US tightens the screws, Maduro lashes out, and before you know it, you're in a cycle of tit-for-tat that neither side can control. The problem with this strategy is that it assumes the other side will eventually fold under pressure. But what if they don't? What if, instead of collapsing, Venezuela becomes a permanent thorn in the side of US interests, a kind of Latin American North Korea, propped up by external patrons and willing to endure any amount of pain to survive. The second alternative is to go on the offensive, not just militarily but economically and diplomatically. The US could, for example, recognize a parallel Venezuelan government in exile, as it did with Juan Guaidó in 2019, and then use that as a legal pretext to seize Venezuelan assets abroad, intercept oil shipments, and even authorize limited strikes against regime targets. This was the playbook used against Manuel Noriega and AMA in 1989, and it worked, at least in the short term. But AMA was a small, isolated country with no major foreign backers. Venezuela is different. It has Russia's nuclear umbrella, China's economic leverage, and a population that, despite its suffering, still remembers the last time the US invaded a Latin American country and doesn't want a repeat. The third option is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: containment. Not the kind of containment we used against the Soviet Union, which was about building a global alliance to counter a single adversary, but a more modest, regional version, accepting that Venezuela is a lost cause for now and focusing instead on preventing the crisis from spreading. This would mean working with Brazil, Colombia, and other regional powers to create a cordon sanitaire around Venezuela, cutting off its supply routes, isolating its leadership, and waiting for the regime to collapse under its own weight. It's not a glamorous strategy, and it could take years, but it's the only one that doesn't risk a wider war. Now, I can already hear the objections. Containment? That's surrender. That's what we did with Cuba, and look how that turned out. And to be fair, those objections aren't entirely wrong. Containment is a gamble. It assumes that time is on our side, that the regime will eventually implode, and that our allies will stay the course. But what if they don't? What if, instead of collapsing, Venezuela becomes a permanent fixture of the geopolitical landscape, a kind of black hole that sucks in Russian arms, Chinese investments, and Iranian proxies? What if, in 5 years, we're still talking about Venezuelan subs, but this time they're armed with Russian hypersonic missiles? That's the paradox of US strategy in the 21st century. The more we try to control the uncontrollable, the more we risk losing control entirely. The Navy can track every Venezuelan sub, the CIA can run every covert operation, the Treasury can impose every sanction, but none of that changes the fact that Maduro's regime is a symptom, not the disease. The real problem is the erosion of US influence in its own hemisphere, the rise of alternative power centers, and the fact that the rules of the game have changed while Washington was busy playing by the old ones. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, as I see it, is that the US will continue to muddle through, applying just enough pressure to keep Venezuela in check, but not enough to provoke a crisis. The Navy will keep its P-8s in the air, the DEA will keep targeting cartel leaders, and the State Department will keep issuing sternly worded statements. And for a while, that might work. But it's a strategy of delay, not resolution. And in a world where delay is often the same as defeat, that's a dangerous game to play. The real question isn't whether the US can respond to a Venezuelan sub. It's whether the US can adapt to a world where the old rules no longer apply. And right now, the answer to that question is far from clear. The Navy may be the best in the world at sinking ships, but sinking ships isn't the challenge anymore. The challenge is navigating a world where the lines between war and peace, friend and foe, victory and defeat are no longer so neatly drawn. And if the last 20 years have taught us anything, it's that the US is still learning how to do that.